I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and you're watching The Daily Question. Today's question of the day, are we taking important things for granted? Now, the reason I'm asking that question is because recently I found myself on a Sunday morning sitting in church with my family, and we were split across two pews because that was the only room that was available for us. And I remember at one stage looking at my wife sitting in the pew in front of me, and she had my young son on her lap. And it just suddenly dawned on me, if you go back 70, 80, 90, 100 years ago, this would have been a very, very different situation in this country. In my country, we sent a lot of people to fight and to participate in both World War I and World War II. And our casualty rate from that was pretty serious. So World War II, for example, there were almost 12,000 New Zealanders who were killed in that war. And we're talking about a country that had a population around that time of approximately 1.6 million people. So that's a lot of people in a country that small. And what that means is that almost every single person in this country at that time would have either been related to someone or would have known someone who had been killed in World War II. Now you go back even further than that to World War I, and our casualty rate was even higher. We had almost 17,000 New Zealanders who were killed in that war. Our casualty rate was 58%. It's a big deal. And so the picture of what life would have looked like on a Sunday morning for those people, 80, 90, 100 years ago in this country is very different. Very, very different to the picture of Sunday morning here in my country right here and right now. And I think there's a real danger that we sort of take that for granted. And I think it's problematic for a couple of reasons. Number one is it shapes us and changes us in ways that are not so good. If we start losing sight of and taking for granted just how privileged and blessed we are to live in a state of relative stability and peace and all the other things that we enjoy in life today, the way things have advanced and in the way things have changed, there's a real danger that we sort of start fixating on the sort of vacuous and superficial or the small things and elevating them into big things. And we sort of lose sight of what, I guess, the blessing we do have in our life today. Instead, it's like, oh, this small thing has got to be elevated into this great crisis. And when we do that, invariably, another thing can start to happen as well. I think you can end up breeding a very the very conditions which lead to some of the problems reoccurring again. So when we take for granted the importance of what it is to and the profound blessing to be able to live in a time of peace and stability, when you take that for granted, I think there's a real danger that you become vulnerable to cycling back into a time of war or a time where we don't have that peace and stability, because these things don't just happen by chance. You actually have to work at it. You have to give yourself to it. And that starts in the small ways that we treat the people around us, and then also the bigger interactions that we have with the world too. And I think there's a real danger that if you take for granted that the things that we have, the advantage, the privilege we have today, because we're not living in that same sort of circumstance, is that you sort of forget that you have to give yourself to that. You have to work at that. If you want a good, stable, and just society, you have to give yourself to that. It doesn't just happen. You can't have a whole lot of people living as individuals in their own little silos, and then somehow out of that springs a peace-loving and connected and flourishing and sort of full society. There's a real danger that society actually breaks down very, very quickly when we take for granted what it is to live in a time of peace, to live in a peaceful and stable society. I also think about the men who participated in those events, and I think about perhaps the character and the virtue that they showed in those circumstances. I think about, for example, my own great-grandfather who fought in World War I. He was sent home from World War I because of a very, very serious illness that afflicted him. But as soon as the government changed the law and they loosened the entry criteria, so previously people with certain health conditions were not admitted to the army, they were not allowed to go overseas and fight. So he's sent home with serious health conditions that prevented him from going back. The government needs more men to go to war, and so what happens is they loosen the criteria. The day after Parliament loosens the criteria, my great-grandfather goes straight in and signs up again to go back. He has this sort of sense of obligation to the men who have been left behind. There's a sense of, I can't just remain here while others are making these sacrifices on my behalf. And that's a very common theme for people who fought in those wars. There's a real sort of sense of virtue and character to the lives of these men. I'm not saying every one of them was perfect or all of them were virtuous men, but there is a sense of sort of a societal level of virtue there that really does matter. And as I said, it got me thinking about this as I was sitting there looking at my wife and thinking, not just how different things would have been, and they would have been very different. You go back 80 to 100 years ago, you know, my family would have been in the same situation, and quite conceivably, they would have been wondering to themselves, well, is our dad coming home? Is my husband coming home? If he does come home, is he going to be so broken by the experience that he will be the same man that he was before? You would have had a family sitting there probably desperately praying and reflecting on the fact that their dad had been away from them for so long. You know, this guy, you know, this sort of the rock of the household, the guy who's our dad and does all the dad stuff with us, he's not here. And he's been away for months or possibly even years. Like, just what does that do to people? The local community, a lot of local communities, there's some big losses in some of our small communities. And these things are really profound. There's a pub that's about an hour's drive from me called the Hilltop Tavern, unsurprisingly because it's on the top of a hill. And there is a famous half-drunk bottle of beer that's encased behind the bar. And the story is that one of the local men from that community went off to war and he had a final beer at the pub and he said, you know, save my beer, I'll be back to finish it later. Well, he never came back, he was killed. And so this beer is now this encased memorial to this man and to this loss that was so devastating to the community that this beer became this sort of memorialisation. We have lots of war memorials around the country where we name the dead. And in some of those small towns, their losses were huge. And just to think about the profundity of what that was and how tragic and difficult that would have been. And here we are today with relative stability and safety and security. And do we take that for granted? And have we perhaps lost sight of something? Is there a loss of virtue and of character within our community? And are we, as a result of those two things, that sort of communal-wide sort of lack of virtue and that losing sight of the things that we shouldn't really be taking for granted and taking for granted some of these things, is there a danger that we could easily fall back into these things? As per usual, I'd love to know your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comment section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. There's a link in the description below and a link on screen at the end of this video. That's right, I can hear my theme music too. I'll see you tomorrow on The Daily Question.